Well, thank you very much for letting me join you even in this sort of remote and surreal way today. It's been really interesting to get to know some of the work that's coming out of this community. As Michael mentioned, my own work is mostly around the legal and sociological implications of new technologies. And one of the areas in which I've been doing a lot of work recently is around the relationship between security and privacy and different forms of vulnerability. So sometimes that's socioeconomic vulnerability, but in the context of this work, I've been really interested in vulnerabilities that arise in social relationships and particularly intimate relationships. So I've been studying privacy and intimacy for probably like six-ish years now in some form or another. And the work I want to talk with you about today arises from an article that came out just a couple of months ago, like right at the beginning of the pandemic, a paper I wrote with Bruce Schneier that was kind of trying to pull together a bunch of work that I and others have done about different forms of intimate threat and trying to see if we could maybe start to understand privacy threats in intimate context as sort of a class of threats and to articulate some design implications of them. So kind of trying to learn lessons from a bunch of really interesting empirical work that other folks have done. So that's what I want to talk with you about today. So kind of the initial, I guess, concern that we had that motivated us to write the paper is that oftentimes I think when we talk about when the information security community and when the general public thinks about privacy and security threat, we tended to focus on a set of attackers that is by now somewhat canonical, right? So we think about adverse governments, we think about companies that may not have great practices or have our best interests at heart. We think about like the shadowy hacker figure, but like, we don't necessarily know who that person is. We think about people who are trying to perpetuate fraud on us and take our money. But a threat that we don't talk about nearly as much, and which I think is inarguably much more widespread and affects people much more commonly, are intimate threats. And when I say intimate threats, I mean privacy violations that occur in the context of intimate relationships, which can include things like romantic relationships, sexual relationships, familial relationships, parents taking care of minor children, people taking care of elderly relatives. I'll talk through some of these contexts. And it's not a coincidence, perhaps, that we haven't paid as much attention to these threats. And these are also the threats that sort of undeniably affect marginalized people the most viscerally, right? So the sorts of privacy threats that we're talking about disproportionately impact women and children and people with physical and cognitive disabilities and the elderly and people who are generally less powerful in these relationships. So just one kind of example of this, what we sort of have seen as this oversight. There's this really wonderful researcher named Julia Slepska, who's at Oxford, and she did this really great meta-analysis last year of 40 different papers that analyzed smart home security. And across these 40 papers, these academics had identified 29 different threat actors that people who are designing security systems for smart homes should think about, and 100 different types of threats, 100 different like threat vectors, but not one of them was a domestic abuser, right? Which feels like potentially an oversight, right? That isn't one of the threats that's being considered. So maybe part of the reason we haven't tended to consider these is that they might strike us as so mundane, right? And I sort of mean that in two ways. One is that a good deal of these threats take place in the context of abusive relationships. So there are some numbers up here that the sources for these numbers come out of our paper, and I can point you to them if you're interested. It's become much, much more common for people who are survivors of abusive relationships, of intimate partner violence, to have, for there to be a technological dimension of the abuse. So in one study recently, 85% of shelters that serve survivors of intimate partner violence had worked with at least one survivor who'd been stalked via GPS. And there are lots and lots of other statistics I could have given you about other technologies that are commonly used in the course of IPV. But then some instances of intimate privacy invasion are not so nefarious as intimate partner abuse. They include things like half of parents in a recent Pew survey saying that they routinely check their teenage children's browsing histories and social media profiles. About a third of participants in another survey admitted that they've looked through another person's phone without authorization. So I expect that, probably, I don't know you people very well, but I would expect that many, many people on this Zoom call have either so the subject to intimate privacy invasion, have perhaps perpetuated intimate privacy invasion, have certainly witnessed intimate privacy invasion. These things happen so often that, again, we may not even think a threat might not even seem like the right word for them. But because they are common, that doesn't mean that they're not important, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not complicated. In fact, one of the reasons we got really interested in studying intimate threat is because a lot of the assumptions that we typically make about privacy and security, and a lot of the assumptions we make about what are effective mitigation strategies, really are either ineffective or actually sometimes counterproductive in the context of intimate threat. So we thought that they were a really interesting area in which to sort of study what some of those assumptions are. And actually, like, it's a very technically challenging area because of some of its unique properties. So what I thought I would talk about today, first, I'll just kind of give you a tour through some of the contexts in which intimate threats likely arise. Then I'll explain kind of, so there are these 4 common features that, sorry, there's like a whole construction project going on in this building right now. I'm sorry if this is distracting. I'll talk a little bit about some of the common features of these threats, and then I'll talk through some implications for design of these systems. So first of all, actually, before I talk about some examples of intimate threats, why is it that people monitor those with whom they're intimate, those who are in their families or with whom they have close relationships? So I alluded to some of these motivations that include things like abuse, the desire for control, sometimes revenge when a relationship goes sour, or blackmail. And I'm not intending to give those short shrift because they're not important, but I think they're like a little bit easier to conceptualize because they're closer to sort of a bad actor, the bad actor paradigm that we are maybe more commonly thinking about in the context of privacy and security threat. But then there's also just this huge range of much more banal and benign motivations, right? So household management, it may be the case that, back when people used to leave their homes, if my partner is commuting and we have an evening plan and I want to know when my partner will be arriving home, I check their location, right, to figure out when they're on their way home, quite possibly with that person's full knowledge. Cultural expectation, right, in certain cultural traditions, it's much more common to have fuller visibility into what some people in your household are doing, particularly women. Safety and security, so I may share information about myself, like about my location, for example, with a person in my family out of a desire to, ensure my safety if I'm walking somewhere at night or something like that. And concomitantly, I may want to monitor my child if my child goes out into the world via, say, location tracking on their phone. This ties closely to fear and anxiety, some of which is, I think, inarguably legitimate, but some of which is also cultivated. So in one study that I did with my colleague Luke Stark, we looked at the marketing rhetorics around a lot of surveillance technologies that are marketed to consumers, and they almost to a product really work hard to cultivate the idea of internal and external threat, right? You need to monitor your baby's breathing because you don't know when they might stop breathing, and you need to monitor your elderly relative out in the world because you don't know when they're going to fall, or you don't know when someone's going to abuse them, right? Like, these are legitimate fears, but they're definitely exacerbated through marketing. You might, monitor to establish trust, to communicate intimacy. Some of my students actually have told me that when they enter into relationships with one another, like, one common thing they'll do is start location sharing with the other person in the relationship. And if one person doesn't want to do that, it's like seen as kind of like questionable, like, why don't you want to tell me where you are all the time? We might do it as a component of a duty of care. So we have not made it easy for people to care for their loved ones and also provide economically for their families, as you may have noticed recently. And so it's not surprising that people have often turned to technology as a means to try to do both, right? As a means to try to, if you can't physically be with your children, to, leave your kids in an apartment with a phone that's on so that you can see them, right? And there have been legal cases where people have gotten in trouble for this, but you can understand why people might do it. And then another really important kind of set of motivations are just accidental, right? Like, actually not intentional or motivated at all, but what we might think of as just involuntary disclosures that happen by virtue of often the design of systems, as we'll get into, right? There are lots of ways in which we sort of, some of the assumptions we make about technology lead to accidental revelation of information to people's intimates. Now, this is obviously a partial list. Dynamic relationship preferences can change over time, so these motivations may intermingle. They're all blurry lines. I don't mean to suggest these are like good. I don't have a normative perspective on this. I'm not saying these are good or bad, or you're a good or bad person if you do or don't use a baby monitor. Like that's not my interest in passing judgment on this, but it's worth noting, right, that there's an interesting continuum between some of the motivations that we might all think of as, you know, not only not harmful, but pro-social, right? Things that we want people to be monitoring about one another, and things that we would all object to, right? There's a lot of like there's a very blurry line between watching out for someone, watching over someone, and watching them. Yeah, so that's important across, I think, all of these contexts. So I alluded already to abuse. I won't go into a bunch of detail about this, but it's important to note that not only, again, is abuse via technological, that uses technological vectors to help facilitate abuse quite common and increasingly common, but that a lot of tools that are sold, for monitoring one's intimates in what we might think of as an acceptable way, like something like a child tracker or an employee tracker, are very easily, they're basically repurposed often from things that we might think of as objectionable. In a paper that I wrote about this, we call these dual use apps, right? So oftentimes one of the reasons it's been difficult to monitor, to regulate things like stalkerware or spyware that you would install on a partner's device, you know, surreptitiously. One of the reasons it's been difficult to get a handle on that market is because it's very easy for those companies to then just rebrand, like put the thing in a different box and say like, okay, well now it's a child tracker, right? It's technically the same thing. It's notable that it takes like almost no technical skill for the user to install this, right? And then we have gathered some evidence, which is in some of the work that we've done, that that the manufacturers of these devices are complicit in the fact that these are being used for this sort of off-label abusive use. So we've done some analysis of what search terms lead to what products coming up, right? So this is old, I think Google has changed this now, but for a while, if you typed into the Google Play Store track cheating boyfriend, you would get a whole bunch of ads for parental monitoring tools delivered to you. In one of these papers that we wrote, we contacted the customer service lines for, I think it was 11 different parental trackers, and we pretended to be a person who wanted to monitor their husband. And of the 11 companies that we contacted, I want to say it was 8, although it's in the paper. I think 8 of them either gave us instructions for how to do it or just, you know, didn't object to it. I think 2 of them didn't respond, and 1 of them said like, maybe you shouldn't do that. So they certainly know that that's happening. I'm not going to read this to you, but this is from an interview study we did with survivors at an IPV shelter in New York City that gives you a sense for sort of the range of abusive behaviors that technology facilitates. So things like posting on a partner's social media as them, or posting incriminating information, or sending that to people who are in their lives. A lot of confusion about how this works, right? So like in the second paragraph, this person says their abuser was uploading text messages from the person's iPhone to another Apple device. It just automatically goes. I don't even really know how it worked. It was through iCloud, which is very conceivable. There's a lot more detail in some of this work about kind of what many different capabilities abusers will use to try to propagate abuse this way. But then another arena other than abuse in which we see this happening a lot, you may have noticed that like every couple of years, you'll see some news story in which like there'll be some public figure who has been cheating on their partner, usually on their wife, and that the wife will have found out about it because the partner's text messages like synced to that person's iPad, right? So this happened a couple of times recently, like it most recently that I remember happened to the governor of Alabama, right? He was writing to his paramour, sending these goopy messages, and he didn't realize that the whole time they're going to his wife's iPad because, right, like if you have an iCloud account, right, it's syncing, it's by default, it's syncing those messages between your devices. And we all kind of like laugh when this happens, right? I think, you know, the tenor in the media tends to be like, well, he sure had it coming, and like, maybe you shouldn't cheat on your wife, and also you should learn how to use computers. But I find that really confusing, right? Because as a privacy community, we should be agnostic as to what it is that, what content of the information is that people want to protect. It's clear that this disclosure is happening involuntarily, and there are just lots and lots of examples, particularly with the iMessage syncing, where we see people not realizing that their private information is being transmitted. I will go through these pretty quickly, but this comes up a lot with minor children, from infants all the way to teenagers. At the younger end of the spectrum, it tends to be more biometric monitoring and video monitoring, so things like baby monitors that you would put in a baby's room. I use those, like those are very common. And then as teens get, or as kids get more mobile, it's more likely to become location tracking and then communication tracking, right? To try and see what your kid is up to online. And I should note, it goes back and it goes the other way too. Sometimes minor children, particularly those who are more technically savvy than their parents, will be able to monitor their parents if they want to. And then also adult children who have elderly parents, we've done a few studies where we've looked at surveillance of elderly parents, both in nursing homes and who are, they call it aging in place, people who want to remain in a private home. And oftentimes a condition of that is that their child will put in like a video system or some other monitoring system that will let them know if they fall or if there's some other problem. I initially came across this actually because in some of my other work I studied truck drivers, and in looking at some of the technology that's used to surveil truck drivers, I was finding, you can see on the right here, that some of those technologies are also used, like they're used for heavy equipment tracking and asset tracking, but also senior tracking, right? So you just attach it to your grandma instead of to your assets, I guess. You know, people do this obviously for peace of mind because they're concerned about, you know, health threats. In the nursing home context, oftentimes the motivation is potential abuse by nursing home staff. So there've been some really terrible, of course, cases in which people who are residents of nursing homes are neglected or abused by staff. And that has led to more desire to oftentimes to put cameras in their rooms to try and protect against this. It's super controversial, right? And in some of our work, we try and unpack some of the privacy implications of this. More than half of residents of nursing homes in the US have dementia, are not cognitively able to consent to monitoring. And so the person who often is their legal representative for purposes of consent is their adult child. It's also worth noting that though we tend to publicize cases in which staff have abused elderly nursing home residents, the most common perpetrators of elder abuse are actually the adult children of the elder, right? So oftentimes we might be concerned about both the abuse and the consent to surveillance coming from the party who wants to surveil the elderly parent. So there's some really interesting and very complicated privacy scenarios playing out there. And then lots of other situations that I won't get into, caregivers, people who deliver intimate care in the home or of dependents, both use and are subject to intimate monitoring, or can also serve as sort of a justification for intimate monitoring, again, because we might be concerned about whether that person is doing a good job or is potentially neglecting to give adequate care. Friendships, roommate relationships, all kinds of other different intimate relationships, this can feature in those relationships. So if we were to look at these threats as sort of a class of problem, what are some features that characterize them? So again, we note 4 in the paper. And the goal here is to try and especially distinguish between like what makes, these are not entirely unique to intimate threats, but they're more commonly associated with intimate threats than many other privacy and security threats that we might think of as sort of that we might more commonly think about. So the first of these is that attackers' motivations are very likely to be quite different in the intimate context. They can include beneficent motivations, as I've discussed, and they tend to be more closely tied to emotion. So though financial motivations may certainly come into play, perhaps occasionally political motivations come into play, much more commonly they're emotional, and they're very strong emotional motivations, right? They can include things like very strong desire for ensuring a loved one's safety, taking care of somebody, and then of course at the other end of the spectrum, a desire for control that can be abusive. But because they're so strongly, because they're sort of what we may think of as you know, not the typical motivations we think about in security, kind of a rational cost-benefit analysis of whether an attack is worth it is probably going to fail in the context of intimate threats, right? People may just be like much more motivated than we might think they would to access an intimate's data. The second feature is co-presence, right? So oftentimes we don't necessarily think about attackers and victims necessarily occupying the same physical space. But in intimate context, we do, right? Like people live with their intimates, they spend a lot of time around them, right? They have access to the same devices, right? They may share a desktop computer. I leave my phone on the coffee table and then my kid walks by and picks it up, or like peeks over at the notifications, right? Those things happen to people all the time. Being co-present with people facilitates a lot of visibility, and we'll talk about why that's important, and access to a device, right? So it becomes much easier for me to actually physically access a device than it might otherwise. And that can reduce the effectiveness of some authentication strategies that we commonly use, particularly things like two-factor, right? Where the idea is that probably the person doesn't have access to both your phone and your computer, or your fingerprint or your retina and your password, right? But those things like are much weaker when people are co-present. And it also is important because it increases the ways in which a victim of privacy invasion can be vulnerable. So in most contexts, right, we tell people, you know, if somebody has access to your bank account, I think someone kept just falling down outside. If someone has access to your bank account, right, cut up your credit card, change your password, like just stop it, right, like stop the invasion. In the context of intimate threat, particularly in abusive situations, it may be in your interest not to do that, or even to indicate that you know that invasion is going on, because of the risk of escalation that's created by having that person physically there. So in talking to some people who work in intimate partner violence shelters, they say, you know, what you don't want is for the person to feel that they've lost control, because then it's much more likely to become a physical or sexual abuse context. You know, it may be the digital abuse is bad, but it's not as bad as some of these other forms of abuse, right? So you have to be very thoughtful about the way you think about ameliorating some of these problems. The third feature is that these privacy invasions are embedded in these relationships that have implicit power differentials, and that often those power differentials are backed by authority. There may be financial dependence, right? I may be financially dependent on the person who owns my phone. I may be on a common family plan with that person, right? That person is allowed to make decisions about my accounts, right? Is allowed to access my data by virtue of being a person on whom I'm dependent. Like we talked about in the nursing home scenario, right? I may have legal power of attorney to consent to things on behalf of a person whose privacy I'm invading. In the context of smart home installation, we often treat the owner of the home as kind of the decision maker, but of course there are plenty of other people who live in homes too. But they may not have authority to decide whether or not something like that is placed in the home. And then finally, attackers in the intimate context have different kinds of resources that they can bring to bear to exploit the vulnerabilities of their victims. So while these attacks are very commonly not technically sophisticated, right, like the most sophisticated one is just off-the-shelf spyware, but most of these don't require anything like that, right? Like they're totally, you know, just based on often, you know, looking at the user interface of somebody else's device. So they're not technically complicated at all. They're very, very easy to execute, but they are very complex relationally, right? And part of that is being able to bring to bear knowledge that another attacker might not have. So if you think about things like questions, right? Secret questions about your first pet or your mother's maiden name, it's extremely likely that the person that you've been in an intimate relationship with for a long period of time will know the answers to those questions. Your first pet might also be their first pet, right? So those forms of authentication become quite problematic. And then also that knowledge provides more leverage potentially for an attacker who's interested in abuse. So there are lots of cases in some of our studies where we find, you know, try to exploit their knowledge of intimate information about someone, like their immigration status. You know, like that becomes the thing that they then advertise on social media. Revenge porn is another really good example of this, right? Having access to intimate images can be a source of leverage potentially for an attacker or fodder for blackmail. Okay, so those are the features. So what do we think people ought to do about this? It's worth noting that there are some proposals to try and regulate some of these legally. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail about what those are, but they are somewhat, some of them I think are good ideas, but they're limited, right? Most of them have to do with stalkerware, with companies that produce this kind of most nefarious brand of intimate monitoring software. And much, like the great majority, I think, of these cases would not be affected by tighter regulation of stalkerware vendors. So a lot of this, I think, comes down to just thoughtful design. And so this is certainly not intended to be like an exhaustive roadmap, but we've tried to highlight a few implications that we think including some good examples of companies that have tried to design with intimate privacy invasion in mind. And I won't take you through this, but this is from the paper. We try and like map between these factors that we've identified and then these design implications. So the first one is just recognizing how it sounds silly, but it's just recognizing that this is a balance, right? That intimate privacy invasion is not always bad or always good, right? Like there are lots of reasons we might definitely want to do it in some contexts. I don't think having a baby monitor is like reprehensible. So, but designers are put in a really interesting position, right? Well, what that means is that you have to acknowledge that some forms of intimate monitoring are legitimate, but also try and find ways to be privacy protective. And the best example I've seen of this is something that is of course now defunct, but I thought it was really smart design, which is this company called License Plus. So there's lots of teen driver monitoring apps, right? And oftentimes they will monitor like everything that is technically capable of being monitored about your teen driver, whether their seatbelt is buckled, of course, their GPS location, their speed, the volume of the radio, like all kinds of information gets transmitted back to the parent. License Plus was really different in the way they approached this. So they made a design decision that parents would not be able to track GPS location. They could only track, I think, city level data. They explicitly tried to involve the teenage driver in the process of coaching, right? They were like, this is about learning to drive safely. So they like incentivize teens in various ways with, you know, gamification, et cetera, which also ensured that they knew that this was being used, right? That was a big deal. And they also finally imposed a limit on the number of hours that monitoring could occur. They were like, well, 100 hours is about long enough to learn how to drive safely. So we're gonna allow a parent to use this with their teen for 100 hours and then it's done, right? And that was, I think, a way to try to acknowledge, you know, to walk this line between the legitimacy of the monitoring and being privacy protective of the teenager. Different forms of data may be differentially sensitive in the intimate context than we might think in other contexts. So, you know, we might normally think something like your bank account, I mean, these can be sensitive too, but there are some forms of data that we might think of as definitely sensitive in many contexts, like financial account numbers, your social security number, et cetera. Those can be, you know, of interest in an intimate threat context, but it's much more likely that it's going to be communications data, location data, information about your calendar, et cetera, that are likely targets, right? Things that we might not normally think of as being particularly sensitive. Because co-presence and device access are often like big vectors for intimate privacy invasion, we have to be extremely attentive to what information can be transmitted visually. I think this is actually one of the biggest, to me, this is, I think, maybe the most important implication. So user interface design becomes really important for thinking about security and privacy in this context, right? If we think about, you know, the way many of our devices have been designed, they have, you know, default notifications on. This has improved a little bit with like the iPhone over time, but it used to be the case at least that, you know, the full text of a, the full text of an iMessage would just pop up by default. My sister actually found out that her boyfriend was gonna propose to her because he was in the shower, his phone was on the coffee table, and his mom texted like, I'm cleaning the ring, like I'm having the ring cleaned so that you can propose to Susie. Which is, of course, like, you know, it was funny and she didn't mean to, like, it was an accident, right? She didn't mean to snoop and find that out. But it's a good example, right, of the kind of thing that often happens. This probably happens to most of us at some point, these sort of accidental visual transmissions. And then there are other kind of more happens too. So like this image on the right is a picture of my kid. You know, when I go to forward that picture to other people in my family, it suggests the most common people that I'm likely to want to forward that to. That's great for usability. So I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have that. But it's important to recognize that that's also information, right? That's being transmitted visually to whoever might be holding my phone or whoever's looking over my shoulder. Same thing with predictive text, actually, and even like indicators of private browsing. So Firefox's private browsing note, like the little indicator in the top right of the window, right, is this little purple circle. That's actually much more subtle than what it used to be, which was that it just changed the color of the whole window, but it's still a visual indicator that you're doing something to try to protect your privacy. There are some companies that do this, I think, really well. So companies that try to sort of disguise, this often comes up in the IPV context, companies sometimes will try to disguise their capabilities as something else. So there's this one, it's not a great app actually, but there's this one IPV assistance app that looks like a newsreader, so that if, you know, your abuser is looking through your phone, they don't immediately think like, oh, this is, you know, the person trying to escape victimization. Another, actually, it's sort of funny, in a funny situation, another group that's done this really well is the NCAA. So the NCAA, as you may know, hosts March Madness, right? Hosts the tournament, which is lots and lots of games, and some of them take place during the day while people are at work, or in a normal year, they take place while people are at work. And people want to watch the games, but they also like can't necessarily do that in an office. So what the NCAA has done is made these games available online, but has also created this, you can see it's like circled here in red, this boss button. And the idea is, as you're watching basketball at work and everything's fine, but when your boss walks by, you press this button and it pops up this like Excel sheet, right? That looks like very worky, right? It's just some, actually, I think it's advertisements now. It's like, so I think Sony sponsors it now. So it's actually like Sony ad copy, but in a PowerPoint presentation or in an Excel sheet, something that looks like you're working. It's a great idea, right? It's like, it actually is a nice recognition of co-present privacy threat. And some intimate partner violence resource pages have taken a similar approach, and they'll have like an escape button where if you sense somebody is coming by, you press it and it'll like send you immediately to like, you know, a Google page about puppies or something, like something that's not. Okay. Another important implication, and I'm almost finished here, is the importance of default settings. So I think we all know that in privacy and security more generally, default setting is super important because most users are never going to change the default. So it has obvious importance for that reason. But in intimate context, default setting is important for another reason, which is that changing a default can itself create suspicion, right? So if my phone pops up the content of text messages by default and now it doesn't, right? Like that can appear suspicious, right? Like that can appear that I have something that I'm trying to hide from an intimate. Hiding location data. I thought I had a picture of this, but maybe I don't. Oh yeah, it's on the next thing. If you stop hiding location data from an iPhone, it'll pop up in your iMessage with the person you were sharing with that so-and-so has stopped sharing location data with you. Like it's a proactive notice that location data sharing has stopped. That's I think a very odd design choice, right? Because typically if you're deciding not to share location data with someone anymore, that might not be something that you necessarily to somebody's attention. So you might want to be, in designing these notifications, you might want to be thoughtful about how much of this you want to be really overtly obvious to people and how much you want it to be discreet. And you might even consider whether some sort of decoy data is appropriate to avoid what we sometimes call the blank slate problem, right? You don't want to have no data, right? Because that, again, is an indication that you might be trying to hide something, and that could cause further problems in intimate settings. Similarly, you want to recognize that privacy and sharing preferences change over time, again, to allow discrete changes to them. This image on the right is what I was talking about, right? Where when you stop sharing location with somebody, it lets the person know. Facebook has actually done some interesting work in this respect. So on Facebook, if you change your relationship status to indicate that you've broken up with somebody, Facebook now has this suite of tools that it will use to try to actually like help you use Facebook differently as a result of the breakup. So it will do things like ask you if you want to change some of the settings to ensure that the person you broke up with can't see your posts anymore, for example, right? Or it can you can decide that you don't want to see posts from the person you broke up with anymore, things like that. And then finally, the last thing is to ensure that technology designers should not treat households as monoliths in which all the people in the household share the interests of the purchaser, right? So there are going to be contexts where households share technology, right? Households share, account access to Netflix, or households have, smart home technology that's necessarily shared among people. But there are things that we can do potentially to ensure that we can still protect individual privacy within those households. There's been a bunch of interesting research about different potential ways to do this. Some like really basic ones first are just providing visual or oral notice of data capture. So try to make it obvious when something is recording, right? Like have a light that comes on. It's like it's not a be all end all solution, but it can help, right, to ensure that people know that data is being captured about them. Possibly creating possibilities for subdividing accounts and allowing password protection for each one. So like Netflix, for example, does not do this. I share a Netflix account with my sister. I can see what she's watching. She can see what I'm watching. But if we use YouTube TV, we could share an account and not see each other's information, as I understand it. Thinking about common channels for information transmission, doctor's offices actually are really good at thinking about this. Like if you're having a baby and you go to the doctor, they will often ask, like, can we mail you, or can we send your voicemail information about your pregnancy, because, based on the recognition that other people are likely to have access to that information besides you. And then finally, considering some of the costs of the usability that we try to support with seamless integration. So, there are certainly reasons why we might want our iMessages syncing across devices, but there are also definitely contexts in which we don't want that, right? And trying to design in ways that acknowledge that a lot of devices are shared, or that they're not necessarily personal to the purchaser or to the account holder, is another really important consideration. So all of this, just to sum up, perhaps this goes without saying, requires taking a really thoroughly socio-technical approach to understanding privacy and security, because a purely technical approach is going to miss all of this, right? It's going to miss both the motivations, the reasons why ameliorative steps often fail, and several of the vectors through which these privacy invasions can occur. So this is the paper that we wrote that lays all this out, and then I've also listed some of the work that's cited in that paper that gets at some of these more specific intimate relationships. Thank you very much.